Hey y'all, it's Jennifer. Welcome back to my channel. Today I'm coming to you with my 2K Q&A answers. So I don't think I will be answering these questions in any kind of particular order. So let's just get right into this. We are going to start with what I think is potentially the greatest question I've ever been asked. This is kind of shallow, but who do you think is the most attractive historical figure? And I love this question, and I want all of you to tell me who you think is probably the most attractive historical figure. Please let me know in the comments down below. But when I first read this question, one name and one name only immediately popped into my head, and that's Mark Antony. I just feel sure that Mark Antony was a really good looking guy, and I think there's probably like a level of frat boy to Mark Antony that would be rather off-putting, and it's not typically my kind of thing, but I think what would be really attractive about Mark Antony is not only would he really probably be, visually a very handsome man, but he's somebody who's also really self-assured and confident. So I imagine he's not all that intimidated by really strong, powerful women, because of course he was with Cleopatra. And I think for Cleopatra to be into you, there has to be a level of confidence and being self-assured, and yet probably not arrogant to a really irritating degree. I'm sure Mark Antony was arrogant, but I think there are probably a lot of personal qualities to Mark Antony that make him really, really attractive. But another name also automatically popped into my head. I immediately thought Mark Antony. And then I thought Cesare Borgia. And I think this is on a purely physical level because Cesare Borgia was a nasty piece of work. And he's absolutely not somebody that you'd want to go on a date with. I would absolutely go on a date with Mark Antony, but not with Cesare at all. I think Cesare would be really, really handsome. There's this kind of iconic portrait of him. I'll see if I can insert a picture of it here. And his nose looks a little bit small. His nose looks very narrow. But if you have seen, I think this was the Netflix Borgia series, and Mark Ryder played Cesare Borgia. He looks almost exactly like this portrait. Like they genuinely could not have picked a better actor to portray him, especially in the later seasons. And I think if he looked like Mark Ryder, I would think Cesare Borgia was very, very handsome. I know a lot of people are attached to Francois Arnault, who was on the more famous Borgias series with Jeremy Irons. And I also really like him. I think he's very handsome as well. But Mark Ryder kind of captures that really raw quality that I imagine Cesare Borgia really had. So I think Cesare Borgia. And I think also probably Louis XIV. I think there is a level of attractiveness to kind of any person in power, especially in history, to any king, such as like in the case of Henry VIII. I think there was probably a level of attractiveness to Henry VIII that possibly came from the fact that he had a lot of power, more so than what he looked like physically. And so sometimes I take these kings who had a lot of mistresses, I take that with a grain of salt regarding how good looking they may or may not have been. But I feel sure that Louis XIV was absolutely as handsome as I've always imagined he was. This is also really informed by the Versailles television show, because I just think he was played so spectacularly by the actor on that show, and he had such beautiful hair on that show. It was really easy to kind of visualize Louis XIV like that, and I also think the time in which Louis XIV lived was an excellent time in terms of fashion for men, and so I just think I would probably be into that as well. But I would love to know who you think the most attractive historical figure is. I think honestly my true answer is probably really Mark Antony, because I think Mark Antony would not only be attractive physically, but I think there would be something to his person, something to his personality that would also be really charming. So Mark Antony is probably my truest answer. And I think Cleopatra was probably also really beautiful. It's unfortunate that apparently in the modern day, a lot of people kind of want to disparage Cleopatra and say she wasn't really as beautiful as all these sources talk about her as being, that she was just really clever, really smart. Well, in its own way, that's a version of being beautiful. Her intelligence and her cleverness is a form of being beautiful, is a form of being attractive, absolutely. But I think this is also always said kind of like, oh, she can't have it all. She can't be beautiful and brilliant. Absolutely she can. There are tons of women who are beautiful and brilliant. Let Cleopatra have this. I'm sure she was an absolutely beautiful woman. Got a lot of questions about where I am planning to travel next. Once these travel restrictions are over, where am I planning on going? And I am dreaming big, and I really want to return to France. I have been to France a couple of times. I've been to Paris a couple of times, and Paris is always at the front of my mind. When I say I want to go to France, I often mean I really want to go to Paris, but I also want to go somewhere else. But Paris is always on my mind. I am a very stereotypical American in that way. I love Paris. I know a lot of French people really dislike Paris. I think the French kind of view Paris the way we Americans do New York, as like a big bustling city, but it's not all the country has to offer. And I completely understand that, but I really love Paris. Paris is one of my favorite cities in the world, and I always want to go back, and there's always more to discover in Paris. It's a really wonderful city. And so the next time that I go, I will definitely hit Paris, but I would also really like to go to the Loire. I have been thinking about the Loire Valley for a few years now and kind of tentatively planning what I would do there. There's a lot of really beautiful chateaus in the Loire. There are a lot of really beautiful towns in the Loire Valley as well, like Blois, if I'm saying that correctly, Blois. That's on my bucket list. That town is really high on my bucket list. Not really sure why. It's just a place that calls to me. And I would also really like to go towards the south of France. I would love to go to Nîmes, if I am saying that correctly, and I'm probably not. I would love to go to Nîmes. I would love to go to Carcassonne. That is really high on my bucket list, Carcassonne, which I have heard is a bit of a tourist trap, so I'm a little bit apprehensive about it, but it's essentially a kind of a fortified castle that was a town that they have preserved, kind of a little bit like a walking museum, but you can stay there. It's just beautiful. The pictures of it are stunning. I would love to go there. I would love to go to Toulouse. I would love to go to Burgundy. I have been to Brittany, but I didn't see enough of it, so I would love to go to Brittany. I'm really open to going anywhere in France because it's just a really beautiful country. The people are really kind, and they're very forgiving with my terrible French, but France is definitely where I'm going next. Do you like to shop? And if so, where are your favorite stores? I do like to shop. I frequently shop at H&M. I'm also very stereotypical in that regard. H&M, Old Navy, of course, and JCPenney. I really love JCPenney, and I haven't been there in a very long time, but those are typically the stores that I go to for clothing. Otherwise, I would say I just really love a Hobby Lobby. I love a Kirkland's. What is the first book you remember reading in your adult years that you fell in love with? Now that's interesting because I'm really not too sure. I would say maybe A Court of Thorns and Roses by Sarah J. Maas is probably the first book I remember really taking me by storm as an adult, so that I really was obsessed with. I was really looking forward to the next in the series with, because I think I got kind of burned out on series after Game of Thrones, which I read when I was still a teen, and I loved Game of Thrones, and that was when, you know, we still had hope that another book would come, and so then after that I kind of got the sense that since that book was not coming anytime soon, that I probably really shouldn't get into series anymore. But I picked up A Court of Thorns and Roses because I knew it was a Beauty and the Beast retelling, and I was blown away by it. I think it's pretty popular nowadays to really hate on Sarah J. Maas, to hate on that series in particular, and I don't think it deserves nearly the criticism that it gets. Some of the criticism is absolutely legitimate, but some of it is, this is really popular and thus we should all hate it. I really love Sarah J. Maas, but the Court of Thorns and Roses series is the one I prefer from her. In fact, it took 3 books, I think, for me to say that I was actually into Throne of Glass, which is a sad thing to say. Normally, nowadays, by that point in time, I would have given up on the series, but I plowed through Throne of Glass. I think she has a really compelling writing style, and I think also A Court of Thorns and Roses was always mismarketed. I think it was always said to be YA, and it absolutely is not a YA series, and so I think that's why I really connected with it as an adult, because it read older. than YA, and so I started kind of phasing out of YA and reading more adult fantasy. So I really loved that series. I would say that's probably the first book I read as an adult that I can remember truly falling in love with and automatically wanting to reread. What's one book genre you really can't seem to get into? So this might be a bit of an unpopular opinion because I know this genre has its fans, it has its real staunch supporters, but I hate steampunk. And in fact, when I learned that any book I am interested in might have steampunk elements in it, I take it off my shelf on Goodreads. I have just learned that I really do not like steampunk, and so even when a book is not specifically branded as steampunk, if it just has elements or maybe like a stylistic look to it that is steampunk, I won't like the book. I guarantee you I won't. So steampunk is definitely kind of a subgenre that I really can't get into and I have no interest in. Favorite books you read pre-booktube that you wish had a bigger booktube presence? And that's a really interesting question. I can't think of anything specifically, but I would say in general, there is a lot of historical fiction that I read prior to booktube that I wish booktube was talking about more. In general, I wish historical fiction had a bigger presence on booktube and not World War II historical fiction. Let me put it like that. I think World War II historical fiction gets a lot of airplay, not just on booktube, but in book circles in general. In book publications, World War II is hot, but I, for the most part, am interested in historical fiction that takes place longer ago than that. So occasionally you will see historical fiction break out on booktube if it's something that's winning awards or is nominated, and I'm really, really happy for those people, but there's a lot of really kind of middle-of-the-road historical fiction that doesn't get a lot of hype that I think should really be celebrated and I wish was talked about more on booktube. Which books have you reread most to this day, and which of the more recently read books would you like to reread and why? So my most reread book, I feel for sure, is Interview with the Vampire by Anne Rice. That's still my favorite novel of all time, and there was a period of my life where I reread it at least twice a year. When I was in high school, that was the type of kid I was. So I have reread Interview multiple times over the years. It's been a long time since my last reread of it. In fact, I'm due for a reread, but I am always a little bit cautious about that now when it's been so long since a reread that I wonder if the book is really as good as I remember it being. I know Interview will still have that special something, but I wonder if I've kind of aged beyond it. I hope not. But one of the books that I've read more recently that I would like to reread is Romantic Outlaws by Charlotte Gordon. I know, and I could just read another nonfiction about Mary Shelley. I could, and I definitely could read another biography of her. I could read her own writing. I want to read her journals, her diaries, but Romantic Outlaws hit me like a ton of bricks. And I think there was something to the writing of it that really made it spectacular and that made it a memorable read to me. And so I just really appreciated the poetry of this and how it tied Mary Shelley and her mother's life together. It was just a really wonderful read, and I do think I will probably reread it. Who is a person in history you would like to have a chat and tea or coffee with? And so I often say Alfred the Great or Richard III, so I'm not going to say them today. And I also don't really think Richard would enjoy having tea or coffee with me. I've come to the conclusion that he probably would not really be a talkative person. But who I would like to sit down and have tea with today is Napoleon. I don't know if he would prefer coffee or tea. Probably coffee, because he is half Italian, half French. So maybe we should have an espresso. That would be great. But I would love to sit down and talk to Napoleon. I don't know if I could handle it because I do feel like he's probably an incredibly arrogant person, but I think I would just enjoy talking with him. I think we would have a lot in common, but Napoleon was also a sexist, and he didn't really think women were that smart, and he didn't really think women were capable of understanding things and understanding battle maneuvers and stuff like that. So I would just kind of like to put him in his place too a little bit. So I think that's why I would like to have Napoleon over for tea, is to have a stimulating conversation, but also to kind of put him in his place about women. What makes the medieval times your favorite period in history? And this is a really interesting question because I don't really know. I think I'm attracted to a very certain type of historical figure, and they often exist in the medieval period. So that's probably a large part of the reason that I really love the medieval period. There are a lot of really interesting things that happen in the medieval period, and the medieval period spans 1,000 years. And so much happens within that 1,000 years. I'm really fascinated by what happened after the fall of Rome, by how places transitioned into the so-called Dark Ages. I love that. I love kind of reading about how places started losing the infrastructure of Rome. I'm also really fascinated by the Crusades. I think religion of the Middle Ages is really, really interesting. I love to learn about the church, and I love to learn about the church's interactions with other religions, especially those earlier pagan religions that survived the Roman Empire, but were slowly superseded by Christianity. That's really interesting to me. There's a whole bunch about the medieval period that's really interesting. The Crusades I really love. The Wars of the Roses I really love. I love the 100 Years' War. I think the medieval period is great for a wide variety of reasons, and I suppose I can't really narrow it down to one reason, but those are just a few of the reasons why I like the Middle Ages. I also like the Middle Ages in terms of warfare. I am not a military historian by any stretch of the imagination, and that is not where my interest lies, but I do really like sometimes learning about the battles of the medieval period. It was a whole different thing before they had guns. What are some of your favorite historical landmarks in North Carolina? I've been to Grandfather Mountain. It is so beautiful there. I have never been to Grandfather Mountain, so I'm glad to hear that it is beautiful there. I'm not very well traveled in North Carolina, sadly enough. I often used to go to different states. Like when you go on vacation, when you go to the beach, it's cheaper to go to South Carolina or even Florida. It's cheaper to go down there often than it is to stay at the beach here in North Carolina. And I don't often go to the mountains. I'm not really a mountain girl. I am a beach girl all the way. But in terms of historical landmarks, I would say go to New Bern. That was the old capital of North Carolina. Tryon Palace is a really beautiful area. It's down near the coast, so it's something you can hit if you are on the way to one of the big beaches. But I would say New Bern, Tryon Palace, that's some of the oldest structure that we have here in North Carolina. It's a really big piece of historical significance here. But you can also go up to where the Lost Colony was. So that's near the top of the state at the coast. It's near Manteo, and you can go to a museum there and see a film and kind of get your theories in order for what happened to the Lost Colony. People mistakenly believe the Lost Colony was in Virginia. Folks, it was not. It was here in North Carolina. We had the first English settlement. So that's a really big place of historical significance, not just to North Carolina, but in terms of kind of the colonial settlement here in the United States. And there's a big mystery here because we don't know what happened to these people at all. We have no clue what happened to the Lost Colony. And it kind of scared the English off from coming back over here until around 1607 when they hit Jamestown in Virginia. So those are a couple of our really big places of historical significance here in North Carolina. What are your favorite period dramas? And I also got a question about what are my favorite period costumes. So I thought I would combine those two questions. I do have a video on my favorite historical TV series that I did about a year ago. I will link that up in the cards and down below if you are interested in that. So maybe I will stick to movies since I've already done some of my favorite historical TV series. All of my favorite films are period pieces. So my favorite movie of all time is Titanic. So Titanic is excellent for a wide variety of reasons. It's absolutely perfect. Like genuinely, I don't think there's a flaw in Titanic. That's my personal opinion. I think it's the greatest film ever made. I think it is a feat of filmmaking. Everything about it is spectacular. Its soundtrack, the costumes, the casting, everything is brilliant, but what makes this really special is the amount of historical research that James Cameron put in. Very little is wrong with the film of Titanic. There are a few key things he changed, but that I think makes sense from a filmmaking perspective, but Titanic is a really historically accurate film. Believe it or not, it is a really historically accurate film. And this also goes into the costumes. The costumes are incredibly historically accurate. And my favorite costume, my favorite costume in Titanic is the costume she wears when you first see Rose when she steps out of the car at the beginning of the film, and she's wearing that suit, that striped suit with a wide brim hat. Stunning. That might be my favorite costume of all time. But I also love the red dress she wears when she's about to jump off the back of the ship. I love that dress. I love the dress she wears when the ship is sinking, that kind of pastel, flowy dress, which is beautiful. She doesn't have an ugly costume in this. And the men's costumes are okay, but they don't shine the way that hers do. She really wears some spectacular stuff. And what makes this costume in particular so great is that they clearly pulled this from a magazine of the time. I watched a video that went into kind of researching how Titanic created the costumes and how they were sewn. Everything about this costume that Rose is wearing when she gets out of the car at the beginning of the film is ripped straight out of a 1912 sewing pattern. It's done perfectly, and apparently they even kind of sewed it the way that it would have had to have been sewn in 1912. So this shows in a lot of ways, I guess, that Rose is cutting edge, Rose is fashion forward, she knows what's in the magazines, but it also gives a little added layer to the film, in my opinion. Just absolutely adore this costume, adore this film. Titanic gets a lot of flack for, I think, the same reasons that Sarah J. Maas gets a lot of flack, and that it was very popular, and for a long time, it was all you heard about. And Sarah J. Maas had a similar thing. Just because something is popular does not make it bad. I know we all have a little bit of hipster in us, but Titanic is truly a film that every time I watch it, I feel like I'm seeing it for the first time. It's that spectacular, and it's that spectacular on a home TV. I never saw it in theaters because I was too young, so I didn't see it when it was in the movie theater. I can only imagine how spectacular it was on a wide screen. I can only imagine, but it's truly something spectacular to witness at home too. If you have never watched Titanic, I don't know what kind of rock you've been living under, but give it another shot. If you think it's bad, you're wrong. I'm sorry, you're just wrong. My second favorite movie of all time is Pirates of the Caribbean, Curse of the Black Pearl. And so if I had to choose a historical costume from this, I would actually have to say the men shine far more in this film than the women do, largely because there is one female character. She has to do the brunt of the fashion work for women. But there is a costume that's worn by Will at the very end of the movie. You probably know what I'm talking about. He looks like a Three Musketeer. He's wearing a feather plumed hat, and it's just a spectacular costume. I mean, truly, it's really, really wonderful. And I don't think enough credit is given to kind of the costume that Jack wears, Captain Jack wears throughout this film, because it's also a really ornate costume and you see something different in it every time you look at it. I can't speak to how historically accurate these costumes are, and I don't really care to. Pirates of the Caribbean occupies a really, really special place in my heart. It was my childhood obsession. I had a cardboard cutout of Will Turner in my room 4 years. So I don't have a single part of me that is willing to criticize it. So I don't know that these costumes are historically accurate, and really it doesn't matter. This film is just about having fun. And it's a really, really wonderful swashbuckling film. If you've never watched Pirates of the Caribbean, boy, you are in for a treat. But I do think that the men's costumes really shine in this series in a way that the female costumes do not. I can only think of a couple of things Elizabeth wore that were really memorable, but for the most part, she's put in really muted colors. I think Will actually gets the most beautiful costumes throughout the series. He also wears a really wonderful vest and jacket in the second one, Dead Man's Chest, which I know we're not talking about, but that vest, beautiful. The workmanship on it, incredible. And he also wears something really stunning in the third film, a really wonderful burgundy shirt that kind of is always falling off of his shoulders. It's a really wonderful, iconically pirate outfit. My third favorite movie of all time is also, believe it or not, a period piece, and that's The Mummy. Now, I know The Mummy and Pirates of the Caribbean are not strictly period pieces. They are historical fantasy. But a lot of the costumes in The Mummy, I do believe, are quite accurate. And so I would say my favorite costumes actually are not really in The Mummy. They're in The Mummy Returns. If I had to speak to the series, I really love everything Evie wears in The Mummy Returns. But just speaking about The Mummy, my favorite costume in The Mummy is that black nightgown that Evie wears towards the end of the film. Beautiful. I mean, it's just beautiful. The neckline, how it's sewed, It's just incredible. She has a lot of great costumes, but I also think that the men shine here as well. The men get to wear a lot of really wonderful outfits in The Mummy. I think Rick's outfit in particular looks very stereotypically 1930s, archaeologist, adventurer. It's very Indiana Jones. And so I think that that works really well. I think Jonathan is also styled very typically 1930s. Everything looks exactly like you would imagine a film taking place in Egypt in the 1930s would look. Though now that I think about it, The Mummy might actually take place in the 1920s, so I'm having a bit of an existential crisis. But I feel sure it takes place in 1933. I don't know. But I do think the men also shine here. Imhotep also wears a really great robe towards the end of the film that's also really beautifully sewn. In truth, in these three movies, there are no ugly costumes. They are a feast for the eyes, both in terms of being great period pieces and also in terms of their costuming. What's your favorite circle in Dante's Inferno? So I'm pretty basic in that I really like Limbo, and I also really like Lust. Because I really like the people that we get to meet in those circles. It's less so about the punishment for me because that gets kind of funnier the more it goes on and the more horrifying the more it goes on. But I think you meet some really, really wonderful people in Limbo, some really amazing historical figures, and you also get to meet some really wonderful characters in Lust that I think are really interesting and are the ones that I think I would be the most interested in meeting. Mark Antony and Cleopatra are in Lust, if I'm not mistaken. So I think those two are my favorite circles in Inferno. Do you have a favorite bookmark? I do, but it's really kind of basic in that I like any bookmark that was sent to me by Book Depository. I think their bookmarks are really great because they are so thin, but they're also sturdy enough that they don't really get bent. I would love to know what you studied in Copenhagen, what you thought of it, and when it was. Okay, so I studied in Copenhagen in 2016, and I loved every minute of it. It's the city of my soul. I often think about Copenhagen. While there, I was working on my library and information science master's, and so I took a course that was essentially about disaster planning, and so what you should do if your archive or your library experiences maybe some kind of flooding, maybe there's a fire, what would you do? How would you get the staff out? What items are most important in your repository that you really want to make sure that you save or that are in a really good place that potentially wouldn't get damaged by anything like that. So that was a really fascinating course. I also took a class on the Norse sagas. I took a class on the Fornaldarsogur, or the adventure sagas, which are my favorites. So I really, really enjoyed that. We had the opportunity to go to the Black Diamond, and we saw a manuscript of Ragnar's saga, which is my favorite. We saw, I think, a copy of Charlemagne's Bible that was written in by Einhard. Truly blew me away. I could not believe it. So we got to go to the Black Diamond, and we also got to go to Lyra, which is a place in Denmark that potentially Ragnar, potentially Beowulf also visited. It's a place where there was once a really big great hall in the Viking Age. I loved Copenhagen. I lived right in the city center. I lived next to Rosenborg Castle. I think about that all the time. Like, I know everybody says study abroad changed their life. It truly changed me as a person. I would move back to Copenhagen in a heartbeat. I love it there. I love the people. I do really struggle with the language though, and that kind of holds me back from it. Not that anybody would sponsor me. I know that that's a big ask, but it's a really difficult language, Danish, but I do really love it. I love the people. I love the culture. I love everything about Copenhagen and Denmark in general. So I had a really, really wonderful time, and I think about it once a day, probably multiple times a day. I often think, if I was in Denmark, what would I be doing? So I'm really rather obsessed with it. Do you also read authors associated with the American Romantic period? I'm not sure that I ever have. In fact, I am not very well read in the American classics. I will say that. I think I've read some Mark Twain. I read some Fitzgerald. I do like Fitzgerald. I don't really care for Mark Twain. I really have not read too much from what was published in the 1800s in America, mostly because what I have read I didn't like. I didn't like Little Women. I didn't like The Scarlet Letter. I didn't like Huckleberry Finn. So I feel like those really gave me an indication of the time period. But I do really like the poetry of the time. I really like Henry Wadsworth Longfellow, and I do think he's kind of considered a romantic. So I know I need to branch out. Maybe I need to give some Americans a chance. Top 3 classic authors. Okay, Dante, Wilkie Collins, Mary Shelley. It was that easy. Do you have any significant memories tied to specific books, either in terms of the reading experience or the book as an object? And I do. Often if I am reading a book when I'm going somewhere, I vividly remember the entire reading experience. There are several books from the Last Kingdom series by Bernard Cornwell that I vividly remember, and I remember because I was reading them on a train. I remember, I think it was the 3rd and the 4th book, because actually the journey that the character was taking was very similar to the train journey that I was taking. He was going to Durham, but I was going to York. So we passed through the same cities and towns, but they had entirely different names, and we did it at entirely different points in history. So it was really cool to feel like I was taking a journey with Uhtred, the main character of the Last Kingdom series, while I was on that train. And I was really grateful for trains that day after reading what Uhtred had to go through to try to get up to Durham. But I went up to York that way. And I also read a book that took place in York while I was in York that was another of the Last Kingdom books. And I just thought that was absolutely spectacular. I really, really enjoyed that. I also really vividly remember reading The Lives of the Artists by Giorgio Vasari, because I read it in multiple Italian cafes, and so it's really tied to trips, I would say. I think because you're on like a high when you're on vacation, what you're reading really sticks with you, because I can often remember books that I read at the beach better than books I've read more recently, which seems very strange to me, because when you go to the beach, maybe you go for a few days and you read quite a few books if you're there doing nothing else besides relaxing. And so it's interesting to me that that's a really kind of vivid reading experience for me. So I would say definitely books that I read when I'm on trips, when I'm on vacation. What's your opinion about the books that you're reading now? Well, February has not been the greatest reading month for me. I think I've read a lot, but I haven't read much that was memorable, and I've DNF'd several books, but the DNF that hurt me the most was I DNF'd The Last Man by Mary Shelley, which I felt sure would be a 5-star read, but it was so oddly written, and just nothing was happening. And things that did happen happened off page. Somebody would go do something and you were like, oh, that'd be interesting. I hope we get to go with him to Greece. And then the next page, the character would be back from Greece. A whole lot happened in Greece, but we don't really hear about it, and we didn't experience it with him as a character. So it seems very oddly written, and I've tried to give it the benefit of the doubt because I know it's going to get there for me. And I know that it's really going to probably be something spectacular towards the end of the book, but I just was not in the mood to deal with it. And the sad thing is, I wonder if I'm ever going to be in the mood for it. I don't know that it's for me, and that's a really sad thing to say, because it's the second most famous of Mary Shelley's works. And so I'm kind of curious as to why that is. I know I will come back and finish it one day, but I don't know that it will become a new favorite for me, and I kind of thought it would. I'm also reading The Last Light of the Sun by Guy Gabriel Kay, which is his kind of version of Alfred the Great's life and the raids of the Great Heathen Army, and it is fantastic. Truly, this book is fantastic. This is kind of light fantasy. It definitely takes place in a fantasy world, but it echoes a lot of what was going on historically, and so I honestly have to wonder why he bothered setting this in a fantasy world when he could have just written historical fiction, because nothing that he's written so far is out of the realm of possibility. So I'm kind of curious as to why he chose to do it like this. If he thought maybe it would sell better if it was set in a fantasy world, I'm not sure. But this is really spectacular. It's everything everyone ever told me it was. So hopefully this will save February as a reading month for me. When did you first get interested in the Wars of the Roses and Richard III? So when I read Richard III, the play by Shakespeare, for the first time, I was an undergrad. I was a freshman in college. And when I read that play, there was really no looking back for me, because I felt so extremely sorry for Richard III. I mean, genuinely, I felt so sorry for him. And so from then on, I had a real kind of connection to him as a figure, and I started reading more about him. And then in 2012, they discovered his body, and that was really, really exciting to me. And so I got involved in that side of things and making sure I was keeping up with the news about his body. And then the White Queen miniseries came out. And let me tell y'all, finally, we got a really good portrayal of Richard III. This is the only portrayal of Richard III that I've ever truly enjoyed. And it is in the White Queen miniseries, played by a Welsh actor, Aneurin Bernard, who is absolutely spectacular. Nothing but respect for my Richard III. And I felt totally vindicated watching this miniseries because Richard comes off very well in it. And so I really, really love this fictional version of Richard III, and I think his performance is just so absolutely wonderful. And so over those few years, I think The White Queen came out in 2013, so 2011, 2012, 2013, it was a slow but steady kind of falling in love with Richard himself. And then I fell into the time period as a whole. And what's interesting is I think I started out really enjoying the period of Richard's kingship, and I found those 2 years to be really interesting. And now that is not the most interesting part of the story to me at all. It's kind of the prior decade. That's what I really like to read about now, is kind of the lead up to Richard eventually usurping the throne. So Shakespeare was probably my first entry point, but there was no looking back after that. Do you think some of your disappointment in Austen's style could be in her prose not being very rich in descriptive ambiance? Yes, you have hit the nail on the head. That is exactly why I struggle with her. And I come to that conclusion because she works very well for me in adaptations. I really love to watch a film adaptation or a miniseries of Jane Austen's works, and I often wonder, what about them works so well for me on screen but doesn't work for me on the page? And I think it's because there is so little description. So yes, you've absolutely hit the nail on the head. And I would like to know if anybody else struggles with that. I feel bad every time I say I don't really care for Jane Austen because I know she is a lot of people's favorite author of all time, especially in kind of the classics community. She can do no wrong, but I have always struggled with her. And so I definitely think that's my issue with her writing. Is there something specific which sparked your interest in Florentine Renaissance history and art? I think it was actually probably through the Borgias. I think I read a book about the Borgias first, and then I fell into kind of the wider Renaissance, but specifically the Florentine Renaissance. And I also took a class in college that was about art history to the modern day, but they started in the early Renaissance, the late medieval period, the early Renaissance. And I fell absolutely in love with The Gates of Paradise by Ghiberti in Florence. And that, I think, was my gateway to the realm of loving Florentine art in particular, because that was a moment when I really thought, now that is something spectacular. Often art kind of has a degree of awe to me just because I'm not an artist and so I can't fathom how you did it. But The Gates of Paradise on the Florence Baptistry, the doors to the Florence Baptistry, that truly stunned me in that class. I was blown away by it, and I think that was my entry point to the world of Florentine art. And I think the Borgias, in a weird way, was my entryway into the Florentine side of things historically, because I kind of fell over from the Borgias into the Medicis. So I then got into that kind of side of things. And of course, the Medici were big art patrons, and so everything kind of connected together for me. And now I just really enjoy all of it. I really enjoy Florentine history in general. When/how did you become interested in classics, and do you have any tips to overcome the fear of reading a longer classic, especially when it's not a widely known or popular book? I kind of got interested in classics again after getting out of college because I was really tired of being forced to read classics while I was in college, and so I really needed a break. But I decided to get back into them because I never had the opportunity to study a Victorian classic in college, and I actually very rarely read one in high school. And I felt like I was really missing something culturally. I felt like I was missing a lot of references because so many things refer back to novels of the Victorian period. And so I decided to try my hand at some Victorian novels, and I really fell in love with them. And through that, I kind of got back into reading classics of all sorts. And I think the key thing there is the more you read classics, the easier they are to read, because I really struggled getting back into classics with the language. And so now I try to read a classic every month at least to kind of keep my brain going so that I can understand their style of writing, because I think when you take a break for a long time, you have a hard time getting back into that style and tricking your brain into understanding it again. But I think my advice for a longer classic, and maybe specifically one that's not widely known, that you don't have very many resources on, is to make sure you get a good edition of it. It's often pretty easy to get a really cheap version of a classic on your Kindle, or even get it for free, but it might not be the most updated translation. It probably has no notes. And if it's something that's lesser known, I think you probably will want the notes. Maybe not for a Victorian novel or something more modern than that, where you're catching most of the references, but something older than that, I definitely think notes can be extremely valuable. So I would say get a good edition of the book, and then I would say divide it out and say, I would like to accomplish this book in 2 weeks. There are 30 chapters, so to do that, I need to make sure that I read X amount of chapters a day. Is that going to be too much for me? And then you can decide, okay, then 2 weeks is too short. I'm gonna do it over a month. And then you can divide it down again and do it in chunks that are manageable and that don't stress you out every day. You know what I'm saying? Because with a longer classic, you might find it beneficial to read something else alongside it. I often do, but if you want to read it straight through, I think you want to give yourself some leeway so that you don't get burned out on it, because I think anyway, often get burned out on longer classics because I feel like I've been reading them for too long, if that makes sense, or reading too much of them. And so being so involved in that world. And so I often think it's best to kind of go through and say, I'm going to read this amount of pages per day, or this amount of chapters, if it's divvied out in such a way. I think that can be really helpful, and it can help you feel like you're doing something manageable, because every day when you see what you have to read, you think, well, that's not that much. And if you're really enjoying it, you might go on and start reading the chapters for tomorrow. And so I think that's a really good way to make sure that a longer classic feels manageable to you. Are you interested in the history of the Baltic states? Absolutely. I think that's a really fascinating part of the world. I think what's unfortunate, though, is that often a lot of history, specifically from that region, has not been translated into English. And so it's very hard to get your hands on an English source that's telling the history of that area. So if anybody has any recommendations for a book on kind of the history of any of the Baltic states, please let me know that down below, because I do know a bit from the Danish side of things because I lived in Denmark. I know a lot about how Denmark used to kind of interact with that area in the 1700s, but I don't know anything from their perspective. So I think that would be really interesting. Which classic authors would you love to be able to meet and have a conversation with? And which author would you definitely not want to meet? I would definitely love to meet Mary Shelley and Percy Shelley, because I think we would really get on well, and I think that there would be a lot for us to discuss and to talk about, and we would have a lot in common. But I would never want to meet Dante. I've said that before, and I'll say it again. I think Dante on a personal level would not get on with me. My fear is that there's a lot about Dante personally that I might not like. And then it would be a situation of no longer liking his writing because I don't like him as a person or something like that. And so I feel like that's a case where you shouldn't meet your heroes. I would just absolutely never want to meet Dante. And I also would not want to meet Shakespeare. I don't think you should ever kind of disillusion yourself. I think Shakespeare would probably be a really interesting person, but I absolutely don't want to meet him because I like the idealized version of Shakespeare that most of us have in our heads, of him being this absolute genius, walking around and just coming up with words and coming up with sayings. I don't want to know how he did it. You know, I don't ever want to be disillusioned about Shakespeare. I think he should really enter the realm of legend, and to a certain degree he has. But for me, I want to kind of keep him relegated to legend, if that makes sense. Last but not least, when you're reading a book, especially classics and 19th century and before stuff, do you ever think that even though the book is set in some historic period of the past, you're only in receipt of tidbits of history and remain relatively untouched by the actual history of that period? Does it feel like the history happening in history books has a tendency to be somewhat distant from the history that's happening in novels? That is a really fascinating question, and I actually think so, because I think novels are very interested in telling kind of a social history. I don't think they're interested in really painting a picture of the times to a perfect degree. I think they're very interested in the story that they're telling, and I think that's probably also the case today. You know, when we sit down and write a book that's happening in the modern day, we're not interested in kind of making a time capsule of what's going on right now for later generations. We're just making references to things that we assume everyone is familiar with. And so I definitely think that the history happening in history books is distant from the history happening in novels, because novels are not trying to play with that for the most part. Some novels do, which is a really interesting thing, but I think it's interesting to read classics and novels because they are such a look into the historical period during which they were written. And I think I like classics because to me they almost read like historical fiction for the most part. I don't like literary fiction, but I will often read what was literary fiction in the Victorian period, and I really enjoy it because it is set in the Victorian period. And so for me, I think some of the attraction lies in the time period in which they're set and not so much in the information about the period that they are trying to convey to the reader, if that makes sense. This is a really interesting question, and I really need to think about this. If you have thoughts on this, also let me know that down below, because I think that's a really fascinating question. So thank you guys so much for sending in questions for the 2K Q&A, and also thank you for 2,000 subscribers. I just cannot believe it. But that's going to be all for me today. I hope you're all having a great week. Happy reading. Goodbye.